This is the
Five Stars
podcast.
Let me talk to you.
Hi.
So, what do you guys want to talk about? Tell me when I'm telling lies.
Thanks, guys. Back to you.
What's going on, fellas? Lady fellas? As if there are ladies watching this channel, you have to be an honest-to-God committed wrestling fan. What are you doing with your life? It is time for another one of these Friday podcasts. Or at least on my end, preparing for said Friday podcast. I actually forgot that I have a Thursday call this week for my church, so we will see how the editing process goes. Might be a little pressed for time on Thursday night. The good thing is that both the shows we're talking about this week were on the shorter side, so it won't take that long to piece everything together. But you know what the Friday podcasts are all about if you've been following the channel. We'll be getting into WCW Saturday night, as well as Midsouth television. Of course, if you're new to the channel, make sure you subscribe, leave a like, comment. Do anything you can to spread the good word of the Five Starr Wrestling Report. We are the wrestling podcast nobody knows but everybody needs. Here on Mondays and Fridays for a classic wrestling coverage of all variety. And by that I strictly mean WCW, Midsouth, and the WWF. Still kind of in one of those stagnation periods with YouTube. I checked my analytics the other day. The Rumble views seem to be doing a whole heck of a lot better than my YouTube numbers recently. Which, I mean, that typically comes and goes. There was a Retro Raw review from like 2 weeks ago that did somewhere in the ballpark of 150 views. For me, that's a lot. I figured it was an anomaly, and turns out it was. Because the next Raw review did like 50-something views. And that's normally where my viewership sits at least the bulk of it. I do everything on my end to make sure the algorithms feed the shows out. I spam tags, try to use catchy titles, and the only thing I don't do is use social media to try to promote the shows, which I'm okay with. If I can avoid ever having to log into Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram ever again, I will die a happy man. I don't even have a Twitter or an Instagram. My Facebook has been dormant for going on 5 or 6 years. I probably have like dozens of unanswered friend requests, people reaching out with messages. Nah, probably not. Nobody gives a shit. Apologies if anybody out there knows me personally and has sent a Facebook friend request in the last several years. I'm not intentionally ghosting you, I just prefer not to engage with social media platforms. Does it cost me a lot? Sure, but I don't care. I'm good with waking up every morning, going to work, hitting the gym, writing music, reading books, listening to music, playing drums, singing, doing anything I can to stay busy I mean, living alone isn't always the most fun activity, but I have become quite content with just doing my own thing and not worrying about societal expectations. You know, like, why aren't you married? Why don't you have kids? Why aren't you doing this, and this? The answer is because I would prefer to live a life of satisfaction and peace. It's nice to be able to walk through the front door and hear nothing but the sound of white noise. Maybe some of you can relate, maybe not. Anyway, are we supposed to be doing a podcast? Well, we're doing one right now. I'm just not talking about the thing that the show's all about. Let's get into some of this pro wrestling talk. The stuff y'all came to hear me gripe about. Alrighty then. So we are 1 week out from the return of Robocop. The pay-per-view better known as Capital Combat in some municipalities. But we all know what they're mainly trying to sell. They're selling grief. Pain, blues, and agony is what they're selling. So we got this edition of WCW Saturday Night on the syndicated program. Another one of those shortstop episodes. Last week they had pretty much shot the big angle with Luger and Flair to hard sell the title match for the pay-per-view, where they used poor Sting as collateral damage to set up not only the injury angle itself, but to also set up the return of Barry Windham and everything else that followed as a result. So albeit we didn't really advance much this week beyond what they already shot the previous week, we did, however, hear about the stipulation for the U.S. Heavyweight Tag Title match with the Midnight Express versus Pillman and the Z-Man. Jim Cornette will be down at ringside in a shark cage to prevent interference, which is always one of my favorite wrestling tropes whenever they break out the shark cage gimmick. The one that's designed to prevent heels from interfering, when normally all it winds up doing is the polar opposite. Because, I mean, to be fair, that is kind of the charm of what made those gimmick matches work back in the day. That was where the heat came from. It also worked better when the fans weren't smart and they didn't anticipate the evident interference from the heel. It's a problem with repeating multiple gimmick matches throughout time. You start to pick up on patterns. The only other takeaway I got from it was Jim's comment on the idea that your chances of getting murdered in Washington, D.C. are substantially higher than any other place in the country. And since the pay-per-view is in D.C., Pillman and Zank, their chances of getting murdered next week are better than most. By the way, I don't know if those stats are still true in 2026. I do know that DC is still a relatively unsafe place to live by most metrics. And just because I love looking for any excuse to poke fun at Democratic politicians, who is the current mayor of DC? Because I can tell you one thing, he ain't no Republican. Just throwing it out there. Oh, some other unsafe places to live where the murder rate is considered relatively high. Chicago, Baltimore, Memphis, Minneapolis, New York, LA. All Democrat mayors, by the way. The math seems to be adding up. So we get the opening match of Pillman and Zank versus Mark Kyle and Rick Fargo. Getting back to the topic of Cornette in the cage. Sounds like a kinky porn genre, if you ask me. But him being forced into the cage is less so about the actual U.S. tag title match and more so about what they're planning to do with the whole Robocop thing. I won't directly spoil what happens, but just preparing you for the inevitable stupidity. Pillman and Zank won with a slingshot in about 90 seconds. An assisted slingshot. And then we had a 30-second pre-tape with the Steiners, where in that 30 seconds, they managed to fuck up the dialogue. Rick started ranting about Doom. Then halfway through, he lost his train of thought, to which, as Scott tried to take over to save it, Rick tried to interject with something else, because I guess he remembered what he was going to say. So he cuts off Scotty in the process, but then he paused, and there was like 8 seconds of awkward silence before Scotty continued his thought. And then they just cut the feed. Now, you might ask a very simple question such as, well, you say it was 30 seconds. It was also pre-taped. Why not just redo it? It's a good question. I don't have an answer. Aside from, lol, it's WCW. And by the way, think about that for a sec. Scott Steiner tried to save a horribly bad promo segment on the fly. And if you know anything about Scott Steiner promos in 1990, they certainly were not Big Papa Pump levels of epic. I'll say that much. We weren't getting Steiner math promos back during this time. In fact, I'll even go as far as to say that promo was so bad, it made Lex Luger's interview with JR look like Dusty's Hard Times promo. Not that I'm implying it was a bad promo otherwise. I mean, we all kind of know what to expect with Luger promos. They're normally not anything to write home about. But every so often he digs deep and manages to pull out a pretty damn good promo. And this was one of those, where he talked about being more fired up and more focused than ever before, how he's had every obstacle thrown in his way since the day he and Flair crossed paths. But things are different now, because they'll be inside a cage at Capital Combat. And this is Luger's chance to make history by defeating Flair and fulfilling his long-time destiny of becoming World Heavyweight Champion. In a sense, it was not anything we hadn't heard Luger talk about before. He even did the signature bicep flex and ripped off his tank top. But for once, it didn't sound like a Luger going through the motions type promos. You know, the one where he's told to go out there and say stuff for 30 seconds. He sounded convincing, sounded passionate. This worked. Now, of course, it doesn't mean a boatload of shit, because we all know that Luger doesn't end up leaving Capital Combat with the title. But you got to take the good with the bad, right? Or what's the old phrase? Glass half full viewpoint. I'm more of a glass half empty kind of guy myself. That took us to Kevin Sullivan and Cactus Jack versus another set of newcomers to WCW here in 1990. You know, last week we had a lot of big returns and top names show up. Barry Windham, Bam Bam Bigelow, Tony Schiavone. – This week we had an actual in-ring debut. It was our very first look at Steve Armstrong and Tracy Smothers, better known as the Southern Boys. Actually, I think they were called the Wild-Eyed Southern Boys here. And they had been wrestling together in other places shortly before they came to the NWA. They started off as a duo in Florida. I think they also had a run in New Japan for a short while, which, admittedly, I'm not up to snuff with trying to speak on the tag team division of New Japan in the late 80s, early 90s. It was not something I was relatively following. But this was definitely their big break in terms of exposure on a major cable network. We've talked about Tracy's work before. Unfortunately, a lot of the stuff we did review with him has been the WWF run from the late 90s when he was Freddie Joe Floyd. And we all know how awful that was. And obviously, Steve is part of the Armstrong dynasty. Kind of goes without saying that he was a natural talent. He definitely didn't achieve the same level of success, I don't think, that his brothers did. Especially Brian. To a lesser degree, you can argue that Brad saw more success in terms of career highlights. But take nothing away from him. Steve was still a great worker. I love the run he and his brother Scott had in Smoky Mountain in '93. Great babyface tag team. And I was actually a fan of their run in WCW. Problem was that they were victims of poor booking, and Jim Hurd is not viewing them as anything beyond underneath talent. They were around for a few years, but they never really achieved any meaningful success. They ended up doing jobs to pretty much every major top tag team by the time '91 rolled around, including the Midnight Express. And those guys have been neutered as much as possible in the last calendar year. But they never won either sets of tag belts. Eventually they rebrand as, what the fuck were they called? Was it the Pistols? I forget, but again, it was all marginal in the grand scheme of things. Once their feud with the Midnights petered out in October when Cornette and Lane left, I mean, the Southern Boys experiment had pretty much run its course. A shame, too, because they were a really solid team. They actually started to gain a little bit of momentum from what I remember. But again, you got to look at who was overseeing the book from now until the end of the year. I mean, you can only get so far when management isn't fully behind you. They actually got a little bit of a babyface flurry here. There were some missed timings and shaking moments with the double team offense. You could probably chalk that up to nerves. Eventually, the heels took over and slowed things down for a little bit. The Southern Boys eventually made their comeback. Then after things broke down in the ring, Sullivan dumped Smothers over the top rope for the automatic disqualification. At which point they worked over Steve in the ring until Norman and Mike Rotunda hit the ring to even the odds. Eventually you had Abdullah out there as well. I mean, for what it's worth, they went above and beyond to try to protect the Southern Boys here. I know they end up getting involved in a program with the Freebirds pretty soon, which we'll see how much of that I remember. I seem to recall the Birds getting the better of the Southern Boys throughout most of that program, but who knows? So then we came back for a Horseman interview where we learned about the Horsemen's trump card, their ace up the sleeve, so to speak, the fourth addition to the group to keep them at full strength. And of course, who am I referring to? Sid Vicious, baby. All 6'9" of them. And this was Okay, look. You all know how much of a Sid mark I am. I've been quite outspoken about my love for everything Psycho Sid. No matter how good or bad or ugly it was, Sid was, as he's defined many times throughout his career, the man. With that said, this reveal was... God, I don't even know. You ever just watch those segments in wrestling where you see that they're not entirely on board with what's going on, but that they have to sell it like they're super excited and super into everything that's happening? That's what it was like seeing them reveal Sid as the fourth man here. And while I was by no means a fan of Sid and the Skyscrapers with Dan Spivey, him being a horseman always just seemed very out of place. Kind of like they were trying to force fit a square peg into a round hole. I mean, there were several issues, but first and foremost, this completely undermined Barry Windham. I mean, you think about the visual of them. Barry was what? 6'6", 270 pounds. When he was a member previously, he was already considered the muscle of the group by most standards. When it was him, Arn, Tully, and Rick, like that was his role. That was the reason he was brought into the group. So you bring him back, thinking he was tailor-made for that position, but then you throw Sid in there and, well, for one, all it did was make Barry look smaller by comparison. And again, it just looked very out of place. And I say this as somebody who loved Sid growing up, but him and the Horsemen just was not it. Even with him standing in the backdrop with Flair, Arn, Ole, and Windham, I truly can't describe it any other way. It was odd. It was out of place. It seemed very much out of left field. Now, of course, they set up the story that he was there to combat Robocop, which is silly for reasons that go beyond the scope of wrestling psychology. But then you flash forward and think about what they did with this version of the Horsemen over the next year. Later on, they do that goofy angle with Barry showing up dressed as the fake Sting. But by the time 91 rolled around, Sid had already been negotiating with Vince to go to the WWF. I don't even think Sid was with the company for a full year before he left. This particular version of the Horsemen, I don't think it lasted through the spring of 91, right? There were just a lot of questionable decisions that were being made with this group. Kind of made me wonder what the purpose of it was. You had Barry, you had Arn, you had Rick. Ole was obviously filling the manager role, but you still had the core foundation of the group, right? Sid always just felt like the awkward attachment. The so-called extra wheel that didn't really need to be there, but for whatever reason was. I don't know, it just didn't make a whole lot of sense to me. Also, things that didn't make sense to me. Why Eddie Gilbert was feuding with Samu of the Wild Samoans in a totally random underneath feud. Beyond the simple answer of, why not? Now, you'll recall, some odd weeks ago, they were supposed to have Eddie and Samu wrestle on TV, but then they pulled a last-minute swerve where Samu no-showed the match. only to wind up coming out and attacking Eddie with a chair anyway. So they have been treating this like a heated rivalry of sorts. And so what do they do here? Well, they have Samu jump attack Gilbert before the bell. They wrestle for maybe 1 minute. There is a spot where they inadvertently bump Randy Anderson in the corner, only to then set up a spot where Samu goes to pick up Eddie in a front power slam position. But then he's supposed to do the trip spot where he stumbles over Anderson and falls back with Eddie on top of him. That way Eddie can get the upset pinfall. And then immediately following the slip on a banana peel finish, Samu goes directly after Eddie, traps him in the ropes. At the precise moment that Jim Ross tries to make a sponsor plug for Nintendo gaming systems, I shit you not, that is exactly what happened. By God, Samu has Eddie trapped in the ropes and he's laying into him. And while we beg for somebody to come out and stop this madness, let me tell you all about Nintendo's newest gaming console. Just... what the fuck are we doing here? That's honestly a great euphemism for everything that happened in WCW post-spring of 1990. What the fuck are we doing here? I can tell you what they're not doing is drawing money. So before I talk about the main event, not that there's really anything to talk about with it, but let me first address this Rock and Roll Express Freebirds deal. They shot a pair of pre-tapes with them hyping up the strap match for the pay-per-view. And Ricky and Roberts' promo was pretty standard stuff in terms of babyface material. They said the only two things they believe in are the man upstairs and their ability to fight. And at Capital Combat, they vow that they're going to whip the Freebirds like it's nobody's business. Then Hayes and Garvin did their promo. And it somehow led to Hayes getting on the topic of misbehaving children. And how when parents have their I can't stands no more Popeye moment, sometimes they gotta let loose and whip those young whippersnappers into shape. To which I asked, is Michael Hayes openly promoting beating children with leather straps in a wrestling promo? I love the idea that he would compare a strap match to a situation where a parent has to discipline their child for acting up. These are not one and the same, Michael. Not even close. I mean, I know he's a heel, but for God's sake, let's not openly promote child abuse on nationwide cable television. It is a fucking family show after all, right? But that did lead to Dirty Dutch versus Paul Drake in the closing match. I simply wrote the following sentence. Dutch won with a short-armed lariat. I assure you that nothing else of great substance happened in that prior 2 minutes. And then it was immediately to the interview booth for a Sting promo, so we could do one of those show-closing wild babyface rants. And the thing is, I was so distracted by Sting coming out in pink sweatpants, I completely forgot to pay attention to anything he said. I was just mesmerized by these oversized pink pants. Where in the fuck did he find those? It was kind of like the Luger promo in the sense of, you know what to expect when the Stinger talks. It's a whole lot of nothing, but he's always super fired up. So the people hang on to every word he says. Kind of like a Jimmy Valiant promo. It's just one of those unfortunate things where you know they're buying their time waiting for Sting to get fully cleared. So everything they're doing with Flair and Luger is just a short-term buffer program until they get to the Great American Bash. And we've talked about the whole dynamic of Flair not wanting to drop the strap to Luger in the interim because he promised the belt to Sting. Was it the right call? Should they have capitalized when Luger was still hot? Shoulda, coulda, woulda. I'm not suggesting that they dropped the ball with not putting the belt on Luger when they did, but just like thinking back to all the times Luger came so close to winning the big one, only to get fucked over in the end. I mean, at this point, it's kind of a lost cause. I still think they missed their window of opportunity back at Wrestle War in February. If that was going to be the moment, it should have been then. If for a few months they could have had Flair drop the belt to Luger, win it back in the cage at Capital Combat, and then just proceed with the Sting-Flair feud as intended. What harm would that have done? I don't think it would have made a lick of difference. But that's not what they did. And now we're here with Luger yet again challenging for the belt and not winning it. Again. But we'll talk about all that next week when we do the pay-per-view recap. By the way, Robocop is returning. In case that wasn't already rammed up your asshole as a talking point for the last 3 to 4 weeks. You know, at that point, with how much they've downplayed the card to try to promote this stupid fucking Robocop horror shit, truthfully, if they would have put the belt on Luger at Capital Combat, it would have gotten over like a wet fart in church. Nothing was going to save that pay-per-view with all the dumb stuff they did with Robocop. Which, by the way, isn't it funny how they've done everything to drum up excitement for this stupid fucking character in a movie that we've never seen actually make any appearance on the show? No images, no videos, no context. It's like they wanted us to get excited about a character in a movie that they were trying to cross-promote with the expectation being, what, that people would give a shit? Like, to me, that is still the most baffling part of them titling this thing The Return of Robocop. Who in the WCW audience actually cared about anything involving the remake of that movie? Or whatever they were going for. Spin-off. Was it Robocop 2 that was coming out in theaters that year? Did that movie even do well at the box office? I've never seen it. I have no intention of ever seeing it. That or the first one. But the whole thing just comes off like the world's biggest rib. Apparently they brought in the guy that actually played Robocop in the movie to shoot all the angles of the pay-per-view too. So you gotta wonder how much money WCW lost in producing all that. Paying the actor to come in and get involved in all that garbage. It definitely was not cheap, tell you that. Again, more stuff I can probably save for the rant next week. But I just figured I'd give you a little taste now and prepare you for the torture in 7 days. But let's pitch over to Midsouth Television for the time being. If you saw the review last week, you know what's been going on with Hacksaw Duggan. After General Akbar lit a fireball and severely damaged Duggan's left eye, to the point where doctors have been suggesting that he may never regain full eyesight. And it was a pretty dodgy situation there, but we got some good news to report on this week as it pertains to Duggan's health. JR did a sit-down with him, and it was recently reported that Duggan will in fact make a full recovery. Well, not a full recovery, but he certainly could gain partial vision back, which is obviously good news. You know, it's funny, watching this clip back, even though it was clearly Duggan sitting next to Jim for this interview, like actually seeing him on camera without a full beard, it made him look like a totally different person. Last week, they'd only partially shaved off his beard where the damage had been done to the left side of his face. This week, he was clean shaven, baby. Jim Duggan had that super babyface look. But he talked about looking forward to the future. Doctors are insisting that Duggan still retire from in-ring competition to prevent long-term damage to his left eye. But he's still taking it one day at a time to see where things go. Also, something to point out, not that it made any fundamental difference to the story they were trying to tell here, it was just a comment. I love the idea that Duggan was doing this interview while wearing sunglasses. Now, to be fair, yes, they were outside, but what purpose did these sunglasses exactly serve? He's already blind in one eye to begin with. So that was our status update on Duggan. And we also had an update as it pertains to General Akbar's future contracts with Midsouth. You might also recall from the other week, Watts said he was canceling all future dates for Akbar and Kamala's contracts after the attack on Duggan. But now we're hearing that Akbar met with the Midsouth Board of Directors to create a stalemate of sorts. Basically his way to try to make a legal argument that Watts doesn't have the grounds to cancel any of his future contract dates. And he made some comments on the matter during a pre-tape, talking about how Watts doesn't have the grounds to suspend Akbar, or anybody in his group for that matter. They must have a direct hearing with the board. And since Watts can't do anything about that, Akbar is considered untouchable. So he will be back in the Mid-South area soon, whether the people like it or not. They chalked this up to a grave miscarriage of justice. Joel said, "With the way our legal system works these days, sometimes the perpetrators of the crime are more protected than the victims." Sounds a lot like our justice system today, doesn't it? That didn't take long for Akbar to throw that little wrinkle in there, getting his lawyers involved to ensure that he stays active on Mid-South television, as well as his core army. Hey, say what you want. Money can buy a lot of things in life, and that includes good attorneys. Don't blame the player. Blame the game. No, I'm not referring to Triple H here. Although there is a lot of blame getting thrown his way right now with the state of how bad the WWE product is. Not saying that he's not responsible for how bad it is. I wouldn't solely blame him as the only reason, but he's definitely a big piece of the pie. And so that took us to the final round of the TV title tournament. What was originally supposed to be Jake the Snake versus the winner of Hacksaw Duggan versus Dr. Death from last week. Again, we all know what happened to Duggan. So Mid-South pulled a fast one and decided Dr. Death is going to wrestle a replacement opponent instead. He's not just going to advance to the finals via forfeit. Damn it, he has to earn that right. You know, kind of like how the Snowman earned that right when he was just arbitrarily placed into this tournament semifinal with no qualifications. I call BS. That's blatantly fucking over the heel is what that is. So yeah, the Snowman made his TV debut last week, and he beat Dr. Death to advance to the final round of the tournament, having not done anything to prove that he deserved that spot to begin with. Meanwhile, the heel in this scenario ran the entire gauntlet and won every single one of his qualifying rounds to get to this point. But he's the one we're supposed to be booing in this situation. The math ain't mathin'. And so we get Roberts versus the Snowman, with Bill Dundee serving as the guest referee for reasons that they really did not explain. The minute the Snowman beat Williams in that 90-second squash last week, I immediately knew where this tournament was going. And, you know, I'm just going to call a spade a spade. This match fucking sucked titties. It was bad. I don't know what the hell was going on with the Snowman in this match, but he was horrible here. All he had to do was run wild for a couple minutes, let Jay get a little bit of heat, do the fiery babyface comeback, hit the power slam finish, and get the 3. Not only did the Snowman proceed to fuck up the majority of those spots, he also apparently decided that no-selling Jake's offense was a better option. There was a spot where Jake went to shoot him off so he could do a backdrop. The Snowman literally refused to let Jake shoot him off. I have no other way to describe it. He went to grab his wrist, and the Snowman just refused to run. I've seen a lot of goofy stuff in wrestling. I can't say I've ever seen anything like that before, where a guy refused to take an Irish whip spot for a shoot. And it was made even better when Jake attempted to give him the back body drop, and the Snowman got so tripped up in hitting the ropes, he basically fell into Jake and just kind of leaned over so Jake could kind of throw him backwards. Made even better by him immediately popping back up and giving Jake like 5 body slams in a row. So he botched the back body drop spot, and then he no-sold it. At that point, I determined that the Snowman had no idea what he was doing. There was a setup to the comeback where the Snowman no-sold Jake's punches, which led to him giving Jake the power slam and getting the win with the fastest 3 count of all time. Dundee was probably just trying to take it home. And so then the heels tried to beat up on poor Dundee. That way the Snowman could jog back down to the ring to start throwing the slowest punches of all time on Jake and the Barbarian. In fact, I think I figured out why the Snowman was so bad here, especially in the closing 2 or 3 minutes. He was blowed up. I was watching him throw those windmill punches during the afterbirth. He looked like he was trying to have a street fight underwater. It was so horrible. The worst possible way for the Snowman to win this fucking TV title medal. Like, this was so bad. I legitimately felt sorry for Jake here. knowing that he was deliberately told that he would be doing a job to this guy after he had only been in the company for 2 weeks, to have to go out in this fashion, one of the worst Mid-South TV matches I've seen in forever. I mean, there have been a handful of bad squashes in the year 1985. Nothing to the level of what I saw here. That Kamala versus Thor squash match from several weeks back, that was a 5-star classic compared to this. Oh, also important to mention that they didn't bother to actually present the snowman with the medal after the fact. Nope, they just immediately pitched to the break and got off the segment as quickly as possible. Probably a strategic reasoning behind it. And that was the conclusion to this TV title tournament they've been doing for the last 6 odd weeks. An absolutely atrocious final round wherein the new TV champion didn't even get to physically hold up the medal. Bad times. Now, thankfully, the bad content peaked there. We had Eddie Gilbert and the Nightmare going over Mike Jackson and Mark Reagan. That wasn't bad, it was just kind of there. The Gilbert-Nightmare combination is great, though. I've seen these two work together, especially in a tag team setting. That pairing was such a natural fit. I wish I could just think back to any true standout moments with them as a team before they split later on. But it was a very fast-paced match, especially when Gilbert was in there running spots back with Reagan and Jackson. Everything was just bam, bam, move, move, spot, spot. Not to say there was a problem with that, it was just hard to keep up with a lot of it. They let Jackson and Reagan get a little bit of shine at the end, but once Eddie hit Jackson with a hot shot and tagged in the Nightmare, that set him up so he could give Jackson the pile driver to get the 3. One little story detail they talked about here was something involving the Nightmare giving Ronnie West a pile driver on TV a couple weeks back. That must have been the episode we didn't review, because I don't ever recall seeing that. It kind of seems odd that the Nightmare would have pile-driven a referee and not have gotten suspended for it. Much less fined. But that is apparently what happened. I don't know what poor Ronnie West did to deserve that, but sucks to be him, I guess. Then we had the Snowman back over at the commentary station to do a follow-up promo on winning the TV title. They did at least present him with a $10,000 check here that was also a part of the deal. And he, well, in order to not spend 5 minutes attempting to break down what the hell he was sputtering on about here, he mentioned something about being super proud and thankful, so that he was going to take the $10,000 check, buy a Cadillac, and take all the lovely women around town to show them a good time. He continually gloated about his giant arms and giant chest. I believe the exact term he used was thunder cookers, which even got a mild pop out of JR. And that was more or less the Snowman's attempt at getting himself over with the Mid-South fans. Was him arrogantly putting over how good his body was and how he was going to take the money he won, not use it to donate it to charity, or perhaps do something honorable with it, but that he was going to buy a new fancy car and then fuck all of the local town girls. Now, one may think that those are qualities more befitting of a heel. And in hindsight, it was very much a heel-sounding promo. The only problem is I believe they were expecting the Snowman to come across as a babyface here. Could have fooled me, brother. I wanted to punch him in the face after hearing what he said here. And we all wonder why he never connected in Midsouth. So then we came back for a Terry Taylor demonstration segment. Now they set this up at the beginning of the program, that Taylor was going to come out and demonstrate the figure 4 hold, since he has his sights set on Ric Flair in the NWA World's Heavyweight Championship. He wanted to show the people a couple of his counter holds as he's been training with some of the boys. So they brought out Taylor alongside Steve Casey and Terry Daniels. They went through a series of counters where Taylor let them try to lock in the figure 4, but then he'd reverse it with a kickoff or some kind of pin attempt. And of course, this all eventually brought out Ted DiBiase, Dr. Death, and Thor to kind of rain on Terry's parade. DiBiase talking about how he's sick of watching this little dog and pony show demonstration, saying that Taylor hasn't worked with the figure 4 leg lock enough to be coming out here and doing any kind of demonstration with it. If anyone should be demonstrating the figure 4, it's Ted, the guy that actually uses it as a finish. And so he continued with his heel promo, basically saying that Terry's only providing an example of how to get out of the hole before it's applied. But what happens if Terry finds himself in the actual hold? What's he going to do then? That's why he needs somebody bigger and stronger to come out and have Terry try to put the figure 4 on him. And in this case, he's talking about Thor. Not to get too ahead of myself, though, there was also a great Easter egg teaser in this promo where Ted started talking about Ric Flair and how Flair wouldn't want anything to do with DiBiase if they met face-to-face, because he'd be running scared before they even had the chance to lock up. Which is a fantastic lead into what we're going to see later on this year when those two actually feud. And so DiBiase eventually goads Taylor into working with Thor here for a bit to try to put the figure 4 on him, saying that he's not going to lay down and let Taylor put the hold on him. He's got to work for it. So that's when everyone dispersed momentarily, with the exception of DiBiase, who suckered Taylor in so he could cheap shot him with a right hand and let Thor immediately slap on the figure 4. And that gave Taylor the chance to sell and do the valiant babyface comeback to reverse the hold and get Thor to submit as he turned it over. It is also one of those wrestling psychology deals where you kind of have to suspend disbelief that turning over the figure 4 is a means of overturning the pain on your opponent. I mean, we've seen countless people do that spot over the years. It never really made much sense to me personally. But whatever. Overall, it was a fine little segment. They actually did something similar to this last year with completely different casts of guys. I'm trying to remember now. I think it was Magnum TA with some random collection of baby faces. I think the Fantastics might have been involved. But it was another one of those sparring sessions where the baby faces were demonstrating moves. And like Butch Reed and Buddy Landell came out and got physical with the faces to do the big heat angle. This was kind of a carbon copy of that idea, just slight alteration. Not to say there's anything wrong with rehashing ideas that worked, but that particular angle was something that I thought about as soon as they went through with all this. But there was a lot to take away from it. In addition to furthering Long Taylor's quest to become world champion, they also set up that nice teaser for what we're going to see later on in '85 with DiBiase and Flair, which coincides with DiBiase's face turn. So we came back for DiBiase and Dr. Death versus Steve Casey and Terry Daniels. Another ongoing feud they're currently doing right now is Williams and DiBiase versus the Rock and Roll Express over the Midsouth tag belts. Now that the heels are the new champions, they've been telling Ricky and Robert that if they can't get the job done in their first rematch, that DiBiase and Williams would never defend their belts against them as long as they're champions. So it's one of those do or die situations for the R&R. I'm still not entirely sold on the idea that the heels would have the authority to dictate who they can and can't defend the belts against, but presuming the idea is they're heels, therefore they think they can get away with whatever they want, I can sort of buy it. But they end up going over here after DiBiase put the figure 4 on Daniels. You know, seeing Casey and Daniels out there as an underneath tag team, I mean, it really goes to show how quickly guys' positioning on the card can change. Remember when Steve Casey and Terry Daniels are like the two most heavily featured babyfaces on TV a few months back? Now they're just fodder, essentially. There are 2 more additions to the enhancement roster. I mean, you think, especially when you look at guys like the Snowman, too, there's a lot of trial and error going on with bringing these guys in back in the day, giving them these big pushes out of the gate to see if it would click. Especially in '85, there was a good chunk of them that just didn't work. Like, yeah, you had your Eddie Gilberts and Jake Roberts of the world, but you look at some of these other guys that have come in during '85. Steve Casey, Terry Daniels, the Snowman, Brickhouse Brown, Thor, the fucking Future Nails. You know, guys that just, for one reason or another, never got it. Or just didn't get over with the Mid-South fan base. But it probably explained why Watts gave up on them so quickly. He saw it wasn't working and didn't waste any time moving them down in the pecking order. So you got to give him credit for that. Meanwhile, Jake the Snake Roberts, what I would equate to as Mid-South's biggest missed opportunity in 1985. He came out after the break and cut one of the best fucking promos I've ever heard him do. And you had to figure this was coming. Him griping and bitching about getting screwed over yet again by Mid-South. Saying that he's been waiting for this opportunity at the TV title for months. And he played by the rules. He did everything the right way. He went to the back of the line, worked his way through the whole God-blessed tournament. And what did it get him? It got him the shaft. Because then they throw this stinking Snowman in there at the last minute to come in and steal the title right out from under Jake's nose. He said he doesn't care about the Snowman's background, who he trained with, who his spiritual animal is. None of that matters. The only thing Jake sees is a marked man. You know, he's going to start crippling people to get what he wants. And it's going to start this week with the Barbarian mowing down this Ken Glover fucker. It's... I mean, not to once again jump on my soapbox, but the question must be asked. Seriously, how? How in the hell did Watts miss the boat on Jake Roberts so badly? Like, the fact that this guy never got a run with the North American title at any point, how the hell does that happen? Jake was criminally misused. Like, yes, I know he had his demons. He was by no means a class act man. But he had talent oozing out of every pore in his body. So much charisma, so much personality, so much of what you look for in a top star. Babyface or heel, doesn't matter. And he just never got the true main event run he should have. Not just in Mid-South. It was any company he worked for. Damn shame. And he went line about the Barbarian making an example out of Ken Glover. Glover was most definitely crippled here. In a safe working way. Barbarian came off the top and killed him with a middle rope elbow drop to the rib cage. Then he put him away with a full Nelson. Oh, by the way, going back to the Jake promo, nothing he said was a lie. He absolutely told the truth about getting directly screwed over by Mid-South. As we talked about before, he worked his way through every single round of the tournament. He won all of his matches, only to then have to face a last-minute replacement babyface when he wasn't prepared for it and had no way of knowing it was ever going to happen ahead of time. So, taking all of that into account, what exactly is Jake wrong about? He had every right to call out Mid-South for intentionally fucking him. And that is not something that we, the fans, are supposed to agree with. Is being on board with the heel's complaint about getting screwed. We all see how it's been working out for Bret Hart in the WWF in 1997. Yes, he's technically a heel in the Hart Foundation stable right now, but he has never fibbed about the way management has constantly screwed him over when it comes to the WWF title. We've seen the footage, dating all the way back to last year when he came back. Bret has 100% been screwed over at every turn. You know, they say that pro wrestling tends to have a babyface bias tilt. Now, I don't know how much of that is true in the modern product, but especially going back to the territory days, that is absolutely a valid claim. These poor bad guys just can't catch a break. They're always fighting an uphill battle. So that took us to the closing standby match. It is Brickhouse Brown and Brad Armstrong versus a team that I am not making up. Larry Clark and Chan Chang. Chan Chang, they said, was billed from Korea. You think? With a fucking name like that? Gee, you don't say. I didn't really write much down about it aside from Brickhouse getting the win with a headbutt. It was more so a lead-in so they could play their Brickhouse highlight package that Joel produced and put together. They used Nucleus's Computer Age as the backdrop music. Kind of a similar format to a lot of the babyface packages they play where, you know, they'll show them walking through the streets or going into clubs and getting molested by horny women. It's every man's dream scenario played out in real life. Except, well, this is all clearly staged and phony. Or maybe not. Maybe they just happen to capture on tape girls coming up to dry hump Brickhouse and his friends on the dance floor. It's not entirely improbable. But that was that. Solid show overall. I like the angle with DiBiase and Taylor. Once we got past the finals of the TV title tournament, the show drastically turned around in a good way. It is a period right now as we lead into the summertime where the product doesn't seem as hot as it did a few months back. Like, now that they shot the big angle with Duggan and Akbar, it's them trying to hit the reset button and build up things with Taylor and Flair, trying to focus on DiBiase a lot more. The one thing I can definitely say when it comes to star power, comparing 85 to what we had in 84, it doesn't even come close. Yeah, DiBiase's back in the fold, and that's great. But man, you think back to what we had in 84, we were so spoiled. The Midnight Express, Magnum TA, Mr. Wrestling 2, Nikolai Volkov, The Fantastics, Buddy Landell, Hercules Hernandez, JYD, in the unfortunate state that he was. And that's also when we still had guys like Dr. Death and Hacksaw Duggan and Terry Taylor as the focal stars of the show too. The Rock and Roll Express, can't forget about them. There was just a lot more going on last year compared to what we have right now. While I would say things are still generally good with the product, it is a lot different compared to the previous year. Kind of like they hit their stride and it's kind of tapering off a bit. Still enjoying it though. This is easily my favorite of the 3 review series we do. Going back and reliving all this classic territory footage. And the journey will continue onward. However, not this Monday. So just to recap, no Monday show. And on the following Friday, that will be where we do the Capital Combat pay-per-view recap. So we will not have Midsouth next week. I got to keep my ducks in a row somehow, and again, I'm out of town both Saturday and Sunday this week, so it's just not going to happen. No podcasting, but I will keep in touch, and as always, thanks everybody for coming back to check out the show. Appreciate it. Take care, and peace out.